Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us at today's webinar, facilitated by the National Indian Child Welfare Association. My name is Adam Bacente. I'm the Community Development Specialist, and I'm going to be facilitating our discussion today. And today's webinar, titled Decolonization and Promoting Positive Childhood Experience to Counter the Influence of Adverse Childhood Experiences, is going to be addressed by Dr. Terry Cross, who is the Senior Advisor to the NAYA organization. I will provide a brief discussion, or brief description, before we hand it over to Terry Cross. Emotional memory is stored in a part of our brain that does not rely on words. Trauma and love are both retained there. What we reinforce grows stronger. American Indian and Alaska Native families have experienced repeated historic, intergenerational, complex trauma resulting in an array of adverse childhood experiences. Research data now indicate that children and youth have better outcomes when they experience several culturally based protective childhood experiences. This presentation will examine how culture and caring relationships can help build resilience and promote mental health. The presenter will illustrate why culture matters and how to use it to help heal historic and current trauma. And a couple of housekeeping details before we get started. Feel free to submit your questions through the chat box, and we welcome your questions throughout the presentation, so don't feel that you need to wait until the end of the presentation. We can certainly address it during the presentation. And I also want to mention that we will have a couple of poll questions for folks to answer throughout the presentation. The presentation is scheduled for an hour and a half, but we are going to try to aim for an hour of discussion and then save 30 minutes for questions and answers. So without further ado, I want to hand it over to Dr. Terry Cross.
Thanks, Adam. Well, I'm really glad to be here. Good afternoon, everybody. And let's get started. This webinar is part of the technical assistance series with our system of care communities. And I want to start with a slide. It illustrates that brain chemistry matters. We're going to come back to this because it is closely tied with the next theme. Now, my understanding of how the brain works with regard to emotional memory is very, I tend to oversimplify it so I can understand it. So if anyone has a lot of expertise in this area, please forgive me because my explanation is pretty simple. That outer part of our brains that you see goldish yellow is our thinking part of the brain, where our words and thoughts are processed. But in the internal part of the brain, something known as the limbic system, all of the structures in the inside are the places. It's the area where the emotional memory is stored. And as Adam said in the introduction, those emotional memories are not stored in the form of words, but they are stored in pictures and emotional states and the sense of the environment. And so our memory at that level is not the memory of words. They're certainly tied to words because every bit of the brain is interconnected with the other portions, and they react with one another. But today we're concerned with that internal part of the brain where emotional memory is stored. But the second big theme of the day is culture matters. And most of what we're going to talk about today is how that brain chemistry interacts with our culture, interacts with the experiences we have every day in our families, in the relationships that we have, but also in the patterns and activities that we experience in our culture, many of which in our traditional cultures are designed to promote healing and maintain a healthy emotional experience of the world. We're going to revisit this along the way throughout the presentation. So I'm going to set the frame with looking at trauma. We're going to talk a little bit about how trauma impacts the brain, and we're going to want to talk a little, go back to the source of historic trauma and its presence with us today, not just as historic trauma. And I want to paint the picture that historic trauma is reinforced every day through the what I call our post-colonial experience. So for a colonial power to succeed in controlling the indigenous population where they colonize, they have to do 5 things effectively. They have to take the land, they have to take or control the natural resources, particularly access to food, energy, and water. They have to disrupt the sovereignty, disrupting governance and leadership. And so by taking that the legitimacy of the government onto themselves, they're delegitimizing the government. They have to take the legitimacy of thought, in other words, worldview, language, spirituality, healing. And when this idea of it taking away the legitimacy of thought, it means that the dominant, the colonial power says your educational system, your ways of healing, your language, your spirituality, all of those things are inferior to the colonial process, and commits cultural genocide to eradicate those things. And one of the ways that the colonial power does this is through treating those ways of understanding and knowing the world as if they are primitive or stupid or not legitimate. Finally, the colonial power has to take the children. And because taking the children so disrupts the social fabric of the society, of the indigenous society, that it makes it very difficult to recover. Because when you take the children away, the social norms about how to be a family, how to be with one another start breaking down. And there's the very reason for the culture to be organized around the family is at the very heart of the assault. Now, we're not unique in the United States that this colonial system was employed all over the world, wherever there were indigenous people and there was land and territory and resources that colonial powers wanted to take. The historic era of this, I want to put in context, because prior to Columbus getting here, our ways were intact, our language, our healing practices. And for nearly 350 years after Columbus landed, there was a military balance, and for the most part, our cultures largely stayed intact. It was really a period from the 1830s to 1870s, really only about a 40-year period, when through the policies of removal, creation of reservations, forced relocations, and annihilation, this is the period of time when the buffalo herds were killed, when the canoes and the nets in the Northwest were burned, the orchards in my territory under the Seneca Nation of New York State. All over the country, the food sources were attacked, and we lost estimated millions of people of starvation, but also deaths from military campaigns and from diseases. And so by the turn of the century, 1900, there were only approximately 250,000 American Indian and Alaska Natives left in the country. And so a near annihilation, and then the forced assimilation. It's only been since 1968 that the policies have changed to self-determination. Now, why that is, all of those things are important with regard to the history, the historic trauma, and intergenerational trauma, is all of those things still have their ramifications today. We see the impact today in families of the boarding school era. There's about half of all Indian people alive today were either reared in boarding schools or their children or grandchildren of people reared in boarding schools. There are very few families that this didn't impact. The estimates now is that maybe 250,000 children died in boarding schools. We know that the young people in those schools experienced disease, physical punishment that was abusive, sexual abuse, and withholding of nurturance and care that was bordered on inhuman. The ramifications of all of this from a historical perspective is you see disrupted governmental processes, so tribal governments disrupted, traditional land and the economies taken away, generations of children forced into residential schools, and children taken from their families and raised outside of the culture. Messages of colonialism that live on today with us and are with us on a continuing basis, and this is part of why the historic trauma still lives with us today, and it's not just intergenerational, but there are remnants of the historic trauma that live, and they live in these messages. That indigenous people can't be trusted to know what's good for them. That indigenous people aren't significant enough to count. We show up in the data and, as other, but just not attention paid to the issues. Services can only be provided by indigenous people if they're delivered as prescribed by the colonial power, even if they're not the right services. And it's that superiority of thought, that delegitimizing of our own worldview that has, over the decades, basically disempowered our own ways of thinking, our own helping strategies, and replaced them with services that are in the image of the mainstream. The colonial power is right and can't be modified even when it does harm. We see this in the funding structures today. We see it in what can be funded and what can't. We see it in the imposition of requirements like evidence-based practice. When we know we have good and strong culturally based practices, and yet can only get money to do the the evidence-based practice. It's a remnant of this colonial system, colonial way of treating indigenous people. And then a constant message that indigenous governments aren't ready. I many times gone to Congress to testify or gone to talk to government officials about increasing tribal services, and only to be told that tribes aren't ready to run social services programs, or in the case of Title 40 of that funds the cost of poor children in the foster care system. 17 years we were told that tribes weren't ready. So the next slide is post-colonial and historic trauma. So we experience this trauma in many different ways, intergenerationally, but we also have learned to live the life of that oppression, and we tend to turn it on ourselves. So lateral oppression and violence occurs in our communities. We have internalized the racism. I call that that colonial experience as the great colonial lie. It's a lie that our ways aren't good enough. That it's a lie that you can take somebody's land and it's right, or that you can destroy their language and that's right. These are, but we, if we fall into the trap of coming into alignment with the colonial way of thinking, we can even blame ourselves and internalize the racism and turn against ourselves. That post-colonial trauma leads to identity politics, with who's really Indian and who's not. It's I mentioned the dismembered social norms. That's just the basic human qualities of how we treat each other in relationships, particularly in parenting and in marriage and in maintaining our family structures. And so it's deep damage from the loss of children over generations. And a number of adverse childhood experiences. And I'm going to talk more about the adverse childhood experiences, but these conditions that are created by this post-colonial environment lead to a number of problems that we see day to day in our community, and we experience a blaming of the victim as if that's as if we're the cause of our own problems. Theda Newbreath said, colonialization dismembered our culture, dismembered our people and our families, and our job is remembering. And the double entendre here is intentional. To remember is to put back together, and if we do that by remembering who we truly are as people and as a culture. So today's post-colonial reality for our people is the disparities that we see around us, the disproportionate treatment in the system, the poor outcomes that we have for our children and families in state and federal services that are taken for granted that that's just the way it is. Barriers to self-determination, lower funding, lack of equity in funding of programs, and policies like the Indian Child Welfare Act not fully implemented. Just day before yesterday, the Bureau of Indian Affairs issued regulations on ICWA for the very first time since its passage in 1978. We're grateful for them, but it shouldn't have taken this long. So trauma impacts our children every day. This historic trauma and intergenerational trauma, and it's the complex trauma because these things continue in the form of discrimination and other types of oppression we experience as though in those disparities and in our communities, the violence and sexual assault and the emotional abuse, bullying. We also experience bystander trauma by witnessing that violence. When there's so much around us in community that we can feel the trauma just by witnessing it. It's chronic. Things like poverty and discrimination produce chronic trauma, as well as that historic intergenerational. And as helpers, we can experience secondary trauma. Being close and working with people to help them, we can feel trauma through witnessing it in the families and children that we work with. So I said I would talk more about the adverse childhood experiences, and so many people know about that as the ACEs studies. And the Kaiser Permanente and the Centers for Disease Control studied about 40,000.
We may have lost Dr. Terry Cross.
Oh. Uh-oh. What happened? Are you there? Hello?
I apologize. We might have a little bit of a technical assistance issue.
Hello? What happened? Did I just get cut out?
I apologize. That was on my end.
Oh. Are we good? Good. Okay. So the ACEs studies found that there were several adverse childhood experiences that were related to poor health outcomes and a variety of poor outcomes for adults if they experience these as children. You see the list here: physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, alcohol and drug user in the household. So as you look at this list, someone incarcerated, someone in the household with depression, mental illness, or suicidal, witnessing domestic violence, not having your parent or parents, emotional or physical neglect. We have a poll. I'd just like to ask you, of the children and youth that you work with, how many on average of these risk factors do you think that the young people that you work with have experienced? So if we could have the poll and people can weigh in. I'm not seeing the poll, but maybe others are. Oh, there it is. So you can just type in an answer. And so thinking of children you serve, how many of these adverse childhood experiences do they have on average? 6, 75% of them, 3 to 5. So of the 9, look, the numbers are very high. So ranging from a low of 3 up to nearly all of them. Okay, so our families, our kids experience those risk factors. Let me share with you some data. And if you have, you get an ACE score from how many of these you have, and the score ranges from 1 to 9. In the mainstream population, in the study, an ACE score increases, as the ACE score increases, the risk for problems increase. So you can see it on this model as the adverse childhood experiences increase. You have increased problems in social, emotional, and cognitive areas. have increased health risk behaviors, and you have increased disease, disability, and social problems throughout life, and then early death. A few years ago, the National Indian Child Welfare Association, in partnership with Prevent Child Abuse America and Purdue University, did a national survey of American Indian youth online. Our sample was 110 young people ranging from 18 to 25. You see most of them were enrolled tribal members, more females than males. Growing up in a variety of locations, mostly reservations, a pretty good number in urban areas. What we found is that the percentage of youth in our study with 4 or more of the adverse conditions was twice that of the mainstream population. So the ACEs study had 13%, our study 4 or more, 25% of our sample had 4 or more. Now, that's consistent with what you're telling us, and I keep in mind that our sample was a pretty high-functioning sample because it was a snowball sample started by youth with the National Congress of American Indians Policy Research Center, members of our board of directors, as well as college students, tribal college students. So we were looking at a pretty high-functioning group of kids. But there's good news. I want to just looking at the ACEs studies seems to me it's very discouraging. But I want to share with you some very important information about our culture, about the lives of children, because culture matters. It seems to be a way to reduce the impact of those adverse conditions. In our study, we found that there were several protective factors. Having relationship with supportive adults, positive peer groups, being involved in school activities, having family resources, extended family, and culture or spiritual and religious connections with elders, in particular learning a tribal language, and finally feeling like you have a safe and strong community. Now, some of these aren't specific to Native culture, but they all point to the environment as being extremely important to these issues. Now, one of the things that I want to emphasize here is the importance of caring adults. So grandmas matter, aunties matter, and this is Tessie Williams and her granddaughter, and you can see the picture in the background of a poster that we did many years ago for a prevention poster. So I want to share, I hope this slide is still animated, because when you add the protective factors, oh, it is not. When you add the protective factors to this pyramid, it actually drives down the impact of the adverse conditions. And I wish the original slide had an arrow that pushed down, demonstrating that the influence. So in our study, we looked at comparing the adverse conditions with the protective conditions. And we were looking particularly at delinquency because the study was funded by the Justice Department. The group with low adverse conditions and high protective conditions had the lowest rates of delinquency, only 14%. The group with high adverse conditions and low protective conditions experiences had the highest rates of delinquency. You see it's above 2/3. But even when the adverse conditions were high, the group with the high protective experiences had lower rates of delinquency, than the group with low adverse conditions and low protective conditions. So what this tells us is never too late. It's so important to create and help young people experience those protective conditions, because it will begin to turn around the influence of the adverse conditions in their life. We also examined this related to depression and found that depression was related to a number of things. Higher rates with experienced sexual abuse, lower safe and strong community was associated with depression, one of the protective factors, and the lower involvement with spirituality was also associated with depression. So it tells us that also that these protective experiences it's so important to create in young people's lives. And this next slide is from a literature review and reinforced by data that we have in a study that we're doing with the Native American Youth and Family Center in Portland, Oregon. The items on the left are that are in red are items that our community told us. We asked the question in focus groups, what is a healthy Native youth in Portland, Oregon? The items in red on this slide are the factors that communities thought of as being the positive, what a healthy Native youth is. The items in the right-hand column are all items that are measured in the evidence-based practice literature. So the outcomes that are desired for practices that are evidence-based. You can see community mindedness linked with 5 items, positive cultural identity with 8, and then school belongingness, reduced perceived discrimination, hope, spirituality, positive relationships with adults. So what this demonstrates is if you can create these items on the left-hand side, all of which in some way are associated with our culture or can be enhanced through culture, then you have a much better possibility of decreasing the risk factors and increasing the positive outcomes for youth. And this particular slide comes from a literature review that we have uploaded and that the Institute has made available for you to download if you would like to have it. Okay, so I'm going to ask a question now. I'm going to go back to the slide that's about trauma. No. Okay, we have the next poll. And the poll question is, how much trauma does it take to change brain chemistry? How much trauma does it take to change brain chemistry? A year, a month, an hour, an instant? So tell me what you think. Overwhelmingly, we're early voting here is an instant of trauma. Okay. I'll give you just a minute to think about this. So how much trauma does it take to change brain chemistry? So let's go back to the slides. And I want to move forward. And we can revisit this later if we have time. The point here is that as we remember my first slide, brain chemistry matters. If fear and trauma is stored in the emotional memory, and an instant of trauma can cause brain chemistry change, why would we not also believe that a cultural intervention like a ceremony would also not change brain chemistry and be able to change it almost immediately? What you see is that culture matters because we have ways, historical knowledge about being able to deal with trauma. And my slide here, this is the no-faced doll from Legend, My Tribe. It's called The Secret of No Face. And she is, another of her names is Wahyenta. And you can see, if you look carefully, she has a black and white necklace on. During her, she's a legend about No Face is her hero's journey and looking for her face. In that her hero's journey, she's given a necklace of black beads, and in the center there's one bead that is half black and half white. She asks why, asks about the significance, and the healer, the helper that has given this to her, tells her the black beads are for the bad things that will happen to you on your journey. The white beads are for the good things. And so she asks, why is this one bead in the middle half black and half white? And she's told that some things that start out looking bad will actually be good, and some things that start out looking good will actually be bad. And it's her own judgment, her own discernment that will help her through that. She's also told that her journey and life is a series of things that bring joyfulness and sadness, there are hard things and there are good things, hard times and good times. And to expect that, and that her strength will help her through all of that. And so I think of this as a way culture embeds in our teachings and our children's education historically, that it's a way of influencing the emotional memory to be prepared for hard things and to know that they pass and that there's a balance, and that balance can be restored. So in this idea of brain chemistry, if we're storing emotional memory, and we know that things like speaking a language, having a positive cultural identity, time with elders, spirituality, build up clusters of positive neurons that are emotional memories, that part of our brain that stores both the positive emotional memories as well as the fears and the anxieties and the associated with trauma, that the more we build up the positive experiences and create clusters of neurons in the brain that are associated with positive outcomes or positive experiences, the power of the adverse experiences, the power of the trauma and the fear that's also stored there becomes diminished. And it is said that we can actually have the trauma-based neurons atrophy. As we experience and understand more about how trauma is triggered, we can reduce those fears, and we can further influence them by promoting positive childhood experiences. So, love matters. There's a little book called The General Theory of Love, and it talks about the importance of how brain chemistry is changed through an embrace and a hug, like the one you can see on the screen here, that grandmas matter. What we've learned from our communities as we've done the research work, as we look at what are the things that we teach in our cultures, what are the things that we do in our culturally based services that are building up this and promoting positive neuron clusters in the midbrain in our limbic system. How is that related to culture? Well, it's related to culture because the things that you see on this list are things that heal, things that bring that resilience. It's our culture, it's hope, a sense of safety, a sense of gratitude, touch, laughter. We know that our medicine plants, we use things like smudging with sage because that medicine actually influences our brain chemistry and changes how we feel. It's a way for us to connect spiritually, so we're tapping into that resilience that comes from a spiritual connection. We know that the ancestors heal, that having a sense of connection with ancestors is a healing process. Tears are cleansing and they heal. Our stories are healing. We have healing stories from many different tribes that help us understand how trauma is resolved. Generosity, the more that we give, the more that we share, the more that it positively influences brain chemistry and gives us a sense of hope and well-being, spirituality, ceremony, and finally love. These are culturally based activities, most of them, and it doesn't matter which culture. These are all things done in association with other people and how we interact and how we are in those relationships with others. So as we practice the things that we're taught, we're able to come into healing. So this is my mother and my grandson, and I happen to be visiting my mom just even as we speak. Tomorrow she's celebrating her 91st birthday, and it is a healing for me to be able to spend time celebrating that birthday. So I want to turn this over to Adam and ask for questions or thoughts along the way. How do you see the cultural influences diminishing the impacts of the adverse childhood experiences that you all see around you every day?
Thank you very much, Terry. I'd now like to welcome questions in this portion of our webinar. So feel free to submit your questions through the text box, and I can read them aloud. Looks like we got our first question from Cindy Nation.
Hi, Cindy. Yes, the literature review that I mentioned can be downloaded. I think it's available right on the screen that you have under the file box. Is that?
And Cindy, let it. Yep. Okay. Cindy, let us know if we were able to satisfy your question. I see some folks are typing, so we appreciate your patience.
While we're doing that, Adam, you and I can chat. Did you have any particular questions or responses yourself?
Not necessarily. I did. I was reflecting on the great colonial lie that you mentioned in terms of it. I've heard it actually being told differently in terms of if you tell a lie enough times, then it will be truth.
Oh.
Which I feel mainstream society tells lies and myths about Native people, which a lot of people believe and base their knowledge on. So it's very parallel to what you said in terms of the great colonial lie.
Right. There's a question from Laura. Adam, you want to read it for everybody?
Yeah, sure thing. So Laura says, what would you say are some of the best intervention approaches to address these issues?
I think some of the best approaches are the ones that are based in your own community and your own culture. For example, having spent some time in a number of different communities, but what comes to mind is being part of a equine-assisted therapy session up at Rosebud at Santa Gillespie, and hearing the session using Lakota teachings as the basis, so using a word, and I think the day I was there the word was courage, but the discussion of that word around handling trauma and dealing with fear and anxiety, and then having the experience of then working with the horses in experiencing what it means to be courageous in real time was a real use of the culture to promote that resilience, and because it's done in relationship and in such close proximity and in a group, it really, you could see the positive reinforcement that was happening. Also the canoe journey comes to mind with the Lummi Nation and the use of their traditional teachings and working with young people on social skills and using the term pulling together as a family. So my suggestion is find those things within your own community, within your own teachings that are just the historic instructions of the right way to live, and hold yourself. In many places, we have to search for those. You have to dig and talk to elders, or find the people who know, or sometimes even the look into to your historic stories or teachings to bring those out. So when I travel to communities, I tell them that the answers to these things are right at our fingertips in the teachings that our various cultures hold, and then it's a matter of how do you help children, how do you help young people experience those things firsthand and then hold them in their minds as part of their experience.
Looks like we have another question by Juan. Okay, so is there any current research outcomes on the use of eye movement desensitization reprocessing therapy with the American Indian population?
That's a great question, and I'm going to defer to our research department. So Adam, help me with this one, and what we'll do is see if we can find anything on this and send it out to people, because I'm just a bit familiar with EMDR, and what EMDR is designed to do is to rewire the brain. So it actually interrupts the thought process when trauma is stored in clusters of neurons, and the brain has a hard time doing two things at once. So a therapeutic approach that asks people to bring trauma to mind and then move their eyes rapidly following an object, it disrupts that memory. It disrupts neurons that store that trauma. And there's a lot of speculation about why that works, and of course there's a huge influence of the relationship that the person being treated has with the helper. But I don't know of any data on American Indians with that population, but we have a good researcher on our staff, and we'll ask her to look that up, see if she can find anything. Jen Rountree, who's usually with us on these webinars but couldn't be with us today. Thanks for the question.
And what I can do also, Terry, is send out any information that we have within our archives to the folks that participated in today's call. Okay, is there any more questions for Dr. Terry Cross and I? Okay, well, it looks like everyone has submitted their questions, and I wanted to hand it over to Dr. Terry Cross to close us out today. But I do want to say thank you to everyone who was able to attend today's webinar.